about secure communities, and I want to refer back to a couple of things you mentioned that are really critical, including sort of the definition of what a criminal is. You talked about this attempt to intentionally mislead and confuse the American people, the media, all of us, and a lot of it hinges on this definition of criminal. And just last night I was watching CNN, and John King and CNN and others were putting forward this idea in defense of Cecilia Munoz, who's a White House official, that after all, 55% of the people deported last year were criminals. And so you really start to peel that back and say, okay, now define that for me. Is that somebody who ran a stop sign? Is that somebody who had an old conviction? And once you start peeling that back, getting into the specifics, it's very, very interesting. But I want to get to Adam as well and give him a chance to comment, make his statement. So why don't you take us from there?
Okay, and I'll try to be brief so that we can get to Q&A. So Andre and Sarahi have laid out kind of two of the big current policy debates, right, over independent state legislation and over the Secure Communities program, which incorporates local law enforcement in various ways into the federal enforcement regime. And I guess what I want to do is just provide a little bit of context about the broader debate. I guess by asking sort of two questions. One, the first question is how much of this debate is really about immigration federalism and how much of it is just about the structure of immigration law today? And the second question is, if we do think it's about immigration federalism and local involvement, then what are we really worried about? So what's the real concern when it comes to local involvement? So on the first question, the question whether this is really about immigration federalism, one way to think about that question actually is to juxtapose what Andre said and what Sarahi said. So what Andre described was basically efforts by states and local governments to make their own independent judgments about how immigrants should be treated, what immigration enforcement policy should look like. And there's litigation efforts by organizations like the ACLU and by the federal government to try to stop those state and local governments. Now on the flip side, what Sarahi said was, well, in the realm of ESCOM, what we've got is advocacy on behalf of local governments, arguing that local governments should have more independence, not less, to try to resist participation in the federal enforcement scheme, right? So you've got kind of arguments for less state independence, arguments for more state independence. And how do we reconcile these views? Well, part of it has to do, I think, with not really, deep views about whether states or the federal government should be making policy, but just with a sense that many people have that the policy itself is broken, right? And that immigration enforcement has become increasingly harsh through the years and increasingly incoherent. And I think one of the things we need to understand is how we arrived at this point, right? So in a world where the immigration law that people experience matches the immigration law that's written down in the books, there's much less concern about what states and local governments do. But that's not the world we live in, right? We live in a world where the immigration law that's written down in the books in many ways doesn't reflect at all what we see on the ground. And that's kind of for two reasons, right? One reason is that for a very long time, the government has, partly because of resource constraints and partly by choice, really under-enforced immigration law, right? So we end up with a situation where we have large populations of people living in the United States without authorization, partly because government can't always enforce, but also because the government doesn't want to enforce, right? Even though Congress can't pass comprehensive legislation to expand visa quotas, create programs that will allow more workers to come to the country, interest groups and the government have concluded that they often want folks in the country, and so that's what we've got, right? We've got a situation where we have a lot of people who have no status. And in a world where you have a lot of people who have no status, then there's a large amount of discretion that is essentially delegated by Congress, who we think should be making the policy making, to all the other actors in the system. It's delegated to the executive branch, who can then dramatically change policy, right? Can shift from having an enforcement strategy that's mostly based on federal officials, 12 to 15 years ago, to one that's increasingly reliant on arrests made by local officials. And there's also room for states and local government to get involved because there's large populations of people living in those states without status. And so they're targets that the states can legislate against, right? If all of those folks have status, much harder for the states to engage in the kinds of acts that they relate to. So I think the background condition is that much of this debate, I think, is actually not really a debate about whether it's a good idea to have local governments or state governments involved in setting immigration policy. And instead it's just a debate about whether the kind of immigration enforcement policy we have overall is a good policy, right? Now, if that's what the debate's about, then the efforts both make sense, right? Because if you think that the basic problem is that we have large numbers of people who are here without status, who are susceptible to abuse at the hands of government, and to excessively harsh enforcement policies, then what you want to do, if you're an advocate, is you want to do everything you can to increase the cost of enforcement, and you want to resist efforts that are going to lower the cost. And both the state legislation and the Secure Communities Program are both ways of basically spreading or lowering the cost of immigration enforcement and making more enforcement possible. Right? The state efforts do it by changing the location of enforcement. And there's a lot of state legislatures, so they can pass laws even when Congress can't. And in the Secure Communities Program, it's what you said. You turn every single point of arrest into potential immigration enforcement action. Well, that dramatically lowers the cost of immigration enforcement for the federal government. Okay, so that's point one. Is I myself have some skepticism about whether a lot of this debate is really about immigration federalism or instead just about real dissatisfaction with the overall level of immigration enforcement in the country. So, to the extent we do think it's about localism in some sense, and about whether it's appropriate for local governments to be involved in setting immigration policy, then I think we have to ask, well, why does that concern us? So I guess in the limit we might think it's inappropriate for states or local governments to ever be involved in making the decision about who should get to come to the country or who should have to leave the country. But notice what that categorical position would mean. Because immigration law has really long relied on states to make a lot of those kinds of determinations. So for example, when Massachusetts decides to legalize same-sex marriage, should couples in same-sex marriages, by virtue of Massachusetts' decision, become eligible for spousal visas? Right? That's a difficult question, right? But if we categorically reject the idea that states and local governments should have any role to play in selecting immigrants, then we have to conclude the answer is no. Right? Okay, so, and as a matter of fact, for a very long time, the federal government has relied on state marriage policy, family law, to a certain extent on criminal law, in order to decide who the folks are who get to come to the country and who the folks are who have to leave. Okay, so if there is some involvement, then the question is, what's troubling about this kind of involvement? So what's troubling about the state law in Arizona? What's troubling about the expansion of secure communities? And on that front, I think there are a couple of concerns. And they might make us think differently about different kinds of programs, depending on what our concerns are. So about 10 years ago, when 287G, which is another kind of state and local cooperative arrangement, became prominent, one of the big concerns that a lot of folks had was that immigration enforcement authority was being placed into the hands of officials who didn't really understand the details of immigration law. It's an extremely complicated subject, and if you authorize local officials to make arrests on the basis of suspicion that someone is unlawfully in the country, they're just going to get it wrong a lot, because they don't understand the structure of the law. If that's the concern, right, if the concern is really about a lack of local expertise in these areas, then secure communities is in some ways preferable to 287G. Because it reduces the reliance on local expertise. I mean, that's the whole point of the program, right? The federal government decided not to directly deputize local officials to make arrests on the basis of suspicion that people were immigration violators, but instead, simply to, on the back end of the system, screen people who were arrested for other crimes to see if, on the basis of federal information, those people might be plausibly reportable. So the formal structure of the law relies less on local expertise. Now that said, it still raises other questions, right? Because it still does delegate significant decision-making authority to these local officials. The point of arrest still becomes the crucial point that might cause a person to enter the system of deportation. And so it could be that that's our concern. It could be that our concern is that we've delegated authority to these local officials. Now, how much authority we delegate actually in the secure communities context is a real question, something that we need to know more about, right? So the federal government's view is it doesn't really delegate them any authority. They go about and they make their arrests in the way they've always made them, and then we just screen people out the back end of the system and life goes on. But there's at least anecdotal evidence that that's not what's going on the ground, right? There's anecdotal evidence that when local communities become involved in the secure communities program, right, once they know that their local arrests will trigger a federal status check of any arrestee, there's a chance it might change their local policing practices, right? And there's anecdotal evidence that that has happened. And there's work going on now as part of this litigation, the various FOIA litigation, and work by academics to try to understand whether, in fact, you can show that local police are changing their behavior, right? So, but how you feel about these, various forms of local involvement does depend significantly, I think, on whether you think the real problem is local cops don't have expertise, or whether you think it's that they're going to change the way they run the criminal justice systems in order to try to facilitate deportation, or whether you think it's something else. So I guess I'll try to stop there.
I'll give him a chance to comment, make his statement. So why don't you take it from there?
Okay, and I'll try to be brief so that we can get to Q&A. So Andre and Sarahi have laid out kind of two of the big current policy debates, right, over independent state legislation and over the secure communities program, which
We're putting forward this idea in defense of Cecilia Munoz, who's a White House official, that after all, 55% of people deported last year were criminals. And so you really start to peel that back and say, okay, now define that for me. Is that somebody who ran a stop sign? Is that somebody who had an old conviction? And once you start peeling that back, getting into the specifics, it's very, very interesting. But I want to get to Adam as well about secure communities, and I want to refer back to a couple of things you mentioned that are really critical, including sort of the definition of what a criminal is. You talked about this attempt to intentionally mislead and confuse the American people, the media, all of us, and a lot of it hinges on this definition of criminal. And just last night I was watching CNN and John King and CNN and others.
Incorporates local law enforcement in various ways into the federal enforcement regime. And I guess what I want to do is just provide a little bit of context about the broader debate. I guess by asking sort of two questions. One, the first question is how much of this debate is really about immigration federalism and how much of it is just about the structure of immigration law today? And the second question is, if we do think it's about immigration federalism and local involvement, then what are we really worried about? So what's the real concern when it comes to local involvement? So on the first question, the question whether this is really about immigration federalism, one way to think about that question